Hey everybody, every time I make a video where I point out that the Bible has no inherent meaning, I always get a lot of pushback from folks who either don't understand precisely what I'm saying or think I'm just profoundly mistaken. So I want to use a couple of illustrations to show you what I mean by that. But first I want to describe the process of making meaning with a text from the perspective of cognitive linguistics. When we read a text, there are two phases of comprehension that go on in our minds, and they happen subconsciously and very, very rapidly, almost instantaneously. So it can feel like meaning is just popping into our brains. But what's going on is our minds are looking at a given linguistic expression and then generating all the possible meanings that could be intended by that linguistic expression. And then using the context, non-linguistic cues, and everything around us, our minds try to whittle down those potential meanings to what we believe was most likely intended. And this process is overwhelmingly good enough. We can successfully communicate most of the time because this process has become very refined and very accurate. But it's not perfect. And here's one example of this. If we go into the Bible, the New Testament's book of Jude, there's only one chapter, and in verse 22 it says, "But of some have compassion, making a difference." Now, for years I've asked people what precisely they think this verse is trying to say. And every single person I've ever asked has interpreted it along the lines of, when we have compassion on people, we can have a positive influence or a positive impact on their lives. And that's a wonderful message, and it makes sense of the text, but it has absolutely nothing to do with what was intended by the King James translators. And here's why. When we look at that and our minds generate all the potential meanings, the meanings that it is able to generate are based on our experiences with and understandings of the agreements that have been arrived at by people regarding what kind of semantic content is going to be linked with what kinds of sounds, words, phrases, clauses. And then we whittle down from there. If you have never had experience with, or if you don't have understanding of a specific relationship that someone might intend, you're not going to be able to generate that potential meaning. At the same time, if you are able to generate the correct meaning among the potential meanings, but then for whatever reason whittle it down to the wrong meaning, you're also going to miss the mark. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that the meaning is always entirely in our minds. Our minds are generating the meaning never leaves our minds. So what does Jude 1:22 mean? Well, the notion of making a difference being connected with this concept of having a positive impact or a positive influence was not something that people agreed on until around the year 1900. But the King James Version was translated in 1611, and they had a different agreement back then regarding the semantic content that would be associated with that phrase. Back then, making a difference meant making a distinction, exercising discernment, distinguishing between things. And so the King James translators were trying to say, of some have compassion, but be discerning. Now, here's another example of how this idea of experience with and understanding of those relationships can help or hinder our understanding. When I was a kid and our family would go out to eat at a restaurant, which was a rare occurrence, but when it did happen, servers would ask us what we wanted to drink, and I would say, a Coke. And then they would respond, what kind? And then I would say, a Sprite, or a root beer, or something like that. Now, if that sounds unusual to you, it's probably because you don't have a bunch of experience with or understanding of this use of the word Coke as a generic reference to any soda. This is a regional agreement that not everyone knows about, and even many of the people who do know about it don't agree with it and don't like it. And so our servers in those instances would be aware of that agreement, and so they would know to ask what kind rather than just write down a specific brand of cola. And so that's just one simple example of how different times and places and people can have different experiences with and understandings of the agreements that have been reached regarding what semantic content is going to be linked with what sounds and words and phrases and clauses. And when we're talking about ancient texts from thousands of years ago, there's no metaphysical meaning somehow inhabiting these texts that we get a little chisel and a hammer to excavate. That's just not how meaning works. We have to generate all the potential meaning in our minds and then try to use the available clues to whittle it down to what we think was most likely intended. So going back to Jude, the King James translators were using a pretty late manuscript, and the word that we translate making a difference was in the nominative case, meaning it is associated with the subject of the verb. We now know that it was intended to be in the accusative case. We have much earlier and more reliable manuscripts that have that word in the accusative case, meaning this is not associated with the people who are doing the compassion having. It is associated with the objects of the compassion. In other words, we're supposed to be having compassion on these people who are making a distinction. So the original author of the Epistle of Jude was trying to say, have compassion on some of those who are making a distinction. So what does that mean? Well, there are a lot of potential meanings. This could mean someone who is wavering. This could mean someone who is criticizing. This could mean someone who is inside or outside the group. This could mean a lot of different things. And so we have to try to generate the potential meanings that could have been intended here and then somehow whittle them down to what was most likely intended. And that process involves trying to understand the circumstances as best we can, trying to understand the linguistic conventions and patterns from that time period as best we can, trying to understand the contextual clues as best we can to try to arrive at what we think is most likely. And unfortunately, that's not an exact science. That is something that is frequently going to be influenced by what we want the text to mean, what we may have said in the past, and we want to defend our earlier conclusions. We don't want to be wrong. We don't want to change what we're thinking. It can be influenced by a lot of different things, but the more critical and the more informed the scholarship, more carefully we're going to try to reconstruct what may have been intended by the original authors, rather than what might make the text more meaningful or useful to us. And this is one of the issues with apologetics. Apologists will try to create all those potential meanings, and then they will whittle things down based on what is most useful and helpful for them, rather than what was most likely intended by the original authors and editors in their original sets of circumstances for their original audiences. And so when we're making meaning with texts, we have different options that we can choose from. And the question is, what are we doing to whittle them down? Are we just relying on our own intuition, which is going to be guided by what we want and what is going to make us feel better? Or are we overruling those to try to more consciously and intentionally reconstruct the meaning that might have been most meaningful and most useful to that ancient author thousands of years ago, who might have very different concerns from our own? So when I say the Bible has no inherent meaning, that's what I mean. All of the meaning is generated by us and then whittled down to what we think is most likely. And if we're not careful, if we're not consciously trying to whittle things down based on ancient context rather than modern ones, we're just going to be reading what we want into the text rather than trying to understand the text on the terms of the original authors and audiences and editors.